You laughed at his jokes, invited him into your home, trusted him with your children, and while you watched, he was destroying over 400 lives. He's only number one. 8 other British acting legends committed crimes the industry covered up for decades, and we're counting down every single one, starting with murder. The murderer who became Britain's favorite villain. He was known as Dirty Den on EastEnders, a sly, scheming pub landlord with an oily smirk and a knack for betrayal. On screen, Leslie Grantham was a master of melodrama, the man who helped launch one of Britain's most iconic soap operas. He was every inch the cartoon of working-class villainy, conniving, and always slightly dangerous. Audiences loved to hate him, tuning in week after week to see what scheme he'd cook up next. His portrayal was so convincing, so lived in, that it seemed to come from somewhere genuine. It did. Because long before his rise to fame, Grantham was convicted of a far more serious role. He had taken a life. In 1966, at the age of 19, while serving in the British Army in Germany, Grantham attempted to rob a taxi driver. The plan, whatever it had been, went terribly wrong. There was a struggle in the darkness of that German night. A weapon was drawn, a shot was fired, and when it was over, a man lay without breath. The taxi driver, simply trying to earn his living, became the victim of a young soldier's desperate attempt at theft. Grantham was caught quickly. There was no elaborate manhunt, no dramatic chase. The evidence was clear, the crime undeniable. He was tried in a German court and sentenced to life in prison. For most people, that would be the end of the story. A young man's life destroyed by a terrible choice, destined to be forgotten behind bars. But Grantham reinvented himself in a way few could have imagined. While serving his sentence, he discovered something unexpected: acting. Prison drama programs weren't uncommon, meant to give inmates structure and purpose. But for Grantham, they became something more. He threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised even the program directors. Here was someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Fellow inmates who participated in those early performances would later recall how Grantham seemed to transform on stage, as if he'd found the one place where he could become someone other than a convicted criminal. One prison officer who supervised the drama program remembered thinking that Grantham had found his calling, though he never imagined it would lead where it did. When he was released after serving 10 years, Grantham didn't slink away into obscurity. He enrolled in drama school, working alongside students half his age who knew nothing of his past. He was determined, focused, driven by something that might have been redemption or might simply have been the desperate need to become someone other than the person who had ended another's existence he'd been at 19. By the early 1980s, he was working. Small roles at first, the kind that don't require extensive background checks. By the mid-80s, he was auditioning for something bigger. EastEnders was just getting started, and they needed someone who could bring authentic menace to the role of a scheming pub landlord. The casting director later admitted that when Grantham walked into the audition room, there was something in his eyes, a genuine darkness that couldn't be taught or faked. The BBC cast him. And here's what makes this story remarkable or disturbing, depending on your perspective. They knew. They knew about the conviction. They knew about the decade in prison. They knew that the man they were about to make into one of Britain's most recognizable faces had ended another person's existence. The decision was calculated and controversial. Some saw it as a remarkable story of redemption, proof that the system could work, that people could change, that art could transform lives. The BBC presented it as enlightened, progressive, a chance given to someone who had paid his debt to society. Others were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of celebrating someone who had taken a life. Regardless of how much time had passed or how sincere his transformation appeared, letters poured into the BBC when the truth came out. Some praised their courage, others accused them of glorifying violence. For years, it seemed to work. Grantham became one of the most recognizable faces on British television. Dirty Den was a cultural phenomenon. The public embraced the irony, perhaps even enjoyed it. A real-life ex-convict playing a morally ambiguous villain. It was art imitating life, or perhaps life imitating art. The line between character and actor became deliciously blurred, and that ambiguity made for compelling television. His most famous scene, handing his wife divorce papers on Christmas Day 1986, drew 30 million viewers. One of the highest ratings in British television history. People talked about it at work the next day. It became part of British cultural memory. But the past doesn't stay buried, especially when the present gets messy. In the early 2000s, Grantham was embroiled in a new scandal. A tabloid sting operation caught him in an embarrassing webcam incident while he was filming overseas. The details were tawdry, the kind of thing that normally might blow over with some public contrition and a few months out of the spotlight. But for Grantham, it wasn't just another scandal. It was the crack that brought down the entire facade. The redemption narrative that had protected him for years collapsed under the weight of fresh humiliation. Suddenly, people weren't celebrating his second chance anymore. They were questioning whether he'd ever truly earned it. The carefully constructed story of transformation and rehabilitation revealed itself to be more fragile than anyone had realized. One new scandal, one moment of poor judgment captured on camera, and the entire edifice came down. His career ended not with the dignity of retirement, but with the tawdry exposure of behavior that seemed to confirm what some had suspected all along, that beneath the performance of redemption was someone who perhaps hadn't changed as much as everyone had wanted to believe. The BBC, which had stood by him through the revelation of his past, quietly severed ties. No statement, no explanation. He simply disappeared from their schedules. To some, Grantham remained a redemption story that was never fully redeemed. To others, he was a reminder that the line between character and actor can be razor thin, and that sometimes we can't tell where the performance ends and the reality begins. He wasn't just Dirty Den playing a villain. In the most fundamental way, before he ever stepped in front of a camera, he'd lived as one. In the soap world, villains always come back. They fake their passing, return from exile, somehow survive what should have ended them. But in real life, comebacks are messier. The audience forgives soap characters because they know it's fiction. But when the villain is real, when the crime was real, the capacity for forgiveness has limits. When Grantham's career collapsed the second time, he reportedly told a friend, "I've been playing Dirty Den for 20 years. Turns out I wasn't acting after all." That was the last interview he ever gave. He retreated from public life entirely, living quietly until his passing in 2018. The obituaries were brief and awkward, unsure how to frame a life that contained both genuine talent and genuine tragedy. But as dark as Grantham's story is, he's only number 9. The cases ahead get progressively more disturbing. Number 8 used his intelligence as a weapon. And when caught with something far more disturbing, he claimed it was all for research. The court didn't believe him. Neither will you. When intelligence became the defense, Chris Langham wasn't a household face like some on this list. But his fingerprints were all over British television. An acclaimed comedy writer and actor, Langham helped script award-winning satire from Not the 9 O'Clock News to The Thick of It. In that last one, he didn't just write. He starred as a hapless minister in a political storm of lies, spin, and denial. Ironic in hindsight. In 2007, the irony turned to infamy. Langham was convicted for possessing images depicting the exploitation of minors. The charge was devastating, the details disturbing. But Langham had a defense, one that he delivered with the same articulate precision that had made him successful. He claimed it was research for a role. He insisted, trying to understand the mindset of abusers for a dramatic project he was developing. He wasn't doing this for gratification. He was doing it for art. The court didn't buy it. Neither did the public. There's something particularly unsettling about watching someone use their intelligence as a shield, deploying eloquence and reasoning to explain away something so fundamentally wrong. Langham wasn't some chaotic figure caught in a moment of weakness. He was methodical, deliberate, and when caught, he had his explanation ready. He'd even prepared notes, as if anticipating the day someone might ask him to justify what he'd done. The prosecution presented evidence that he'd accessed the material repeatedly over months, returning to it again and again. That pattern didn't suggest research. It suggested something far darker. When the prosecutor presented the evidence, Langham's defense attorney reportedly asked for a recess. Even he hadn't expected what would be shown. The research defense collapsed at that moment. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned with the guilty verdict, Langham sat motionless, his face unreadable. That same intelligence that had served him so well throughout his career had finally failed him. He received a 10-month sentence and was placed on the offenders register. Unlike others who denied everything until the bitter end, Langham admitted to accessing the material, but maintained that his motivations were professional, not personal. His career wasn't just damaged, it was vaporized. Projects were canceled. His shows were quietly buried, his name excised from retrospectives as if he'd never existed. Even colleagues in the comedy world, many of whom had worked closely with him for years, found themselves fumbling awkwardly when asked to comment. One fellow writer, when pressed in an interview, simply said, "I don't know what to say. I thought I knew him." Another collaborator from The Thick of It requested that their episodes be recredited, wanting no professional association with Langham's name. The unsettling part was who Langham was before it. He was intelligent, articulate, deeply embedded in the industry. He wasn't some chaotic outsider or obvious predator. He was accomplished, respected, part of the system. He had awards, accolades, a career built on making people think as well as laugh. He'd been a guest on interview shows where he discussed art, literature, philosophy. People had admired his mind. After serving his sentence, Langham attempted a return to the public eye. Small projects, niche interviews, tentative steps back toward the career he'd lost. But nothing stuck. The British public, so often forgiving of eccentrics and rogues, drew a line here. In one interview, he was asked if he'd changed. His response, "I still think I was conducting research. I just wish I'd been better at explaining it." The interviewer ended the session early. Langham's career never recovered from that moment. The interview was never broadcast. The production company decided that giving him a platform, even to condemn him, was more than they were willing to do. The research defense failed. And in that failure, the court saw something chilling. A man who believed he was smart enough to explain away anything, even this. Langham ranks at number 8. But the evil we're uncovering only intensifies from here. Number 7 involves violence that became public record. Yet, the industry simply absorbed it and moved on. The villain who brought violence home. He had the face of a villain. Angular, cold, impossible to forget. Darren Nesbitt made a career out of being the Nazi officer, the corrupt inspector, the man with a hidden agenda. British television in the 1960s and 70s had no shortage of roles for such a look, and Nesbitt filled them effortlessly. Directors would call him when they needed someone who could project menace without saying a word. He had a quality that made audiences uncomfortable, which made him perfect for the roles he played. But in 1973, his private life overshadowed his on-screen persona. It wasn't a tabloid rumor or studio gossip. It was a court case. Nesbitt pleaded guilty to striking his wife after discovering she was having an affair. Court documents show the details were disturbing, though not graphically recounted in most coverage. He was fined for causing actual bodily harm, and the marriage ended soon after. The story made headlines. 3 days later, he was cast in a new BBC drama. The industry's message was clear. This didn't matter. The producer who cast him was asked about it in an interview. His response, "We're hiring him to act, not to be a role model." That quote appeared in several newspapers, and the controversy faded almost immediately. Studios ran their calculations. Was the bad publicity worse than the inconvenience of recasting? Usually not, especially if the actor in question wasn't a major star. Mid-level talent like Nesbitt could slip back into work because the stakes weren't high enough to matter. Today, Nesbitt's case is used in law schools as an example of how violence against partners was systematically minimized in the entertainment industry. Students watch his interviews where he calls it a mistake and are asked to identify the red flags prosecutors missed. The exercise is called "When the Industry Looks Away." It's named after his case. At number 7, Nesbitt represents how easily violent behavior was excused, how quickly the machine moved past uncomfortable truths. But we're just getting started. Not all violence leaves visible scars. Sometimes the cruelest acts happen behind closed doors, invisible to cameras, but devastating to those who experience them. And sometimes those acts come from the people who make us laugh the hardest. The comic genius who tortured his family. Peter Sellers once threatened to end his own existence in front of his wife during an argument. When she panicked, begging him not to, he casually sat back down and resumed dinner, as if the whole thing had been a performance to see how much power he had over her emotional state. According to her account, he then asked what was for dessert, as if nothing had happened. The psychological cruelty of that moment, the deliberate terrorizing followed by casual dismissal, stayed with her for decades. This wasn't a one-time incident. His daughter Victoria would later describe being estranged from him for years, calling his behavior profoundly damaging. She wasn't alone in these accounts. Multiple people who were close to Sellers described a pattern that suggested something far darker than lovable chaos. His son Michael wrote in his memoir about the emotional distance, the unpredictable rages, the sense that his father was always performing even at home. Except the performance wasn't designed to entertain. It was designed to control. To the public, Sellers was a comic genius. Unpredictable, brilliant, lightning captured in a bottle. Inspector Clouseau, Dr. Strangelove, Chance the Gardener, each a mask, each a masterpiece of transformation. Peter Sellers wasn't just an actor. He was a shapeshifter, a man who disappeared so completely into his characters that he often forgot to reappear as himself. That uncanny ability made him a legend. It also made him unknowable even to those who loved him. His performances could pivot from slapstick to subtle within seconds. Directors treasured him and feared him in equal measure, never quite sure which Sellers would show up on set or what brilliance or chaos he might bring. Blake Edwards, who directed the Pink Panther films, once said that working with Sellers was like harnessing lightning, thrilling when it worked, terrifying when it didn't. Edwards also admitted that there were days when Sellers simply wouldn't come out of his trailer, refusing to work, refusing to explain why. Production would halt. Hundreds of thousands of dollars would be lost. And then, just as suddenly, Sellers would emerge and deliver a performance so brilliant that everyone forgave him. Behind the scenes, however, a very different version of Sellers emerged. Ex-wives recounted similar patterns in their memoirs. The explosive rages, the controlling behavior, the way he could turn affection on and off like a switch, leaving those around him constantly walking on eggshells. One ex-wife described how he would sometimes refuse to speak to her for days, treating her as if she simply didn't exist, only to suddenly act as if nothing had happened. Another recalled him throwing furniture during arguments, then buying expensive gifts the next day, as if the presents erased what had happened. None of this dented his career while he was alive. In fact, it may have fueled the mythos, the tortured genius, the unstable comic, the fragile ego hiding behind 1,000 faces. These narratives were accepted, even romanticized. The press loved the contradictions. There was always another film, another award, another magazine cover. When Sellers passed away in 1980 at age 54, the obituaries focused almost entirely on his genius. The pain he'd caused was mentioned only in passing, if at all. In recent years, Sellers' legacy has been re-examined with a less forgiving eye. The conversation shifted from how funny he was to at what cost. And while the laughter hasn't stopped, his films remain brilliant. The shadow behind it has grown more defined. Sellers didn't just play men unraveling on screen. He lived as one of them. The performances we treasured were possible precisely because of the darkness he carried. The cruelty, the manipulation, the emotional instability. These weren't obstacles he overcame to create great art. They were the fuel. Sellers created joy for millions, and while causing pain for those closest to him. He made the world laugh while making his family cry. At number 6, his psychological cruelty reminds us that evil doesn't always come with a conviction. Sometimes it comes with applause, with awards, with the excuse that genius requires sacrifice. Sellers channeled his darkness into performance. But the next name on our list made destruction itself a brand. And people got hurt. Real people. With names and families and scars that never fully healed. When chaos became a license to harm, Oliver Reed was not a man you introduced to your parents. He was the actor you invited to a party if you wanted it to end in fire. Known as much for his brawling, boozing, and bravado as for his performances, Reed was both a cinematic force and a living cautionary tale. On screen, he was magnetic. From Women in Love to The Devils to Oliver, Reed brought a raw, volatile energy that made directors nervous and audiences obsessed. His performance in The Devils was so intense, so physically and emotionally extreme, that director Ken Russell said he'd never seen anything like it. Reed threw himself into roles with a ferocity that bordered on dangerous. That same energy curdled into chaos when the cameras stopped rolling. The stories of his drinking were legendary, often recounted with nervous laughter. Bar fights, public tirades, damage to hotel rooms and relationships alike. Reed's off-screen life was a continuous performance of excess. Crew members, colleagues, even insurers came to dread working with him. Some film productions simply refused to cast him, citing the risk as too great. One director who worked with Reed in the 1970s recalled that they had to schedule shooting around his drinking, mornings only, before he'd had too much. By afternoon, Reed would be incoherent or combative, and filming would become impossible. On one film set, crew accounts describe Reed's drunken rage sending a co-star to the hospital. The production quietly paid medical bills and continued filming. The incident never made the papers. This wasn't unusual. It was standard procedure for dealing with Reed's behavior. One insurance adjuster who handled Reed's productions described him as the most expensive actor who wasn't a star, not because of his salary, but because of the trail of broken property and injured people his behavior left behind. Hotels charged triple rates when they learned Reed was staying. Bars refused him service. Restaurants asked him to leave. He once bragged in an interview that he'd consumed 126 pints of beer in a weekend. The myth had outgrown the man, and Reed fed into it eagerly. He seemed to understand that his reputation for chaos had become inseparable from his marketability. The worse he behaved, the more the tabloids wrote about him. The more the tabloids wrote, the more memorable he became. He appeared on talk shows drunk. He challenged hosts to arm wrestling matches. He told outrageous stories that may or may not have been true. The audience ate it up. The strange part was that the more he misbehaved, the more the legend grew. He became a patron saint of lost causes. Fans celebrated his refusal to conform, his middle finger to respectability. He represented something they couldn't or wouldn't do themselves, complete rejection of social constraints, living without apology or restraint. But that celebration came with casualties. The crew members had to work around his unpredictability. The co-stars who endured his volatility. The people in his personal life who bore the brunt of behavior that was romanticized in the press but devastating up close. His second wife described in an interview the terror of not knowing which Reed would come home at night, the charming raconteur or the violent drunk. The roles became fewer as Reed aged, and the industry's tolerance wore thin. Directors hesitated. Insurance companies balked. By the 1990s, he was taking smaller roles in lesser films. His legend fading, but his behavior unchanged. He died in 1999 while filming Gladiator, reportedly after challenging a group of sailors to a drinking contest in a Maltese bar. It was fitting somehow. The last act matching the mythology he'd spent decades building. He was only 61. The director, Ridley Scott, had to use CGI and careful editing to complete Reed's scenes. The film became a massive hit, and Reed's final performance was widely praised. In death, he achieved a kind of redemption that had eluded him in life. Reed wasn't evil in the cold, calculated sense that defines others on this list. But he caused damage to himself, to others, to the strange moral calculus that insists charisma cancels out consequences. At number 5, Reed shows us how celebrity can weaponize destruction, how charm can excuse harm, how legend can obscure the real people left in the wake. But the cases ahead cross lines even Reed never touched. What comes next isn't about self-destruction with collateral damage. It's about violence that was deliberate, targeted, and very real. The gangster playing himself. There are method actors. And then there was John Bindon, the kind of man who didn't just play gangsters in British crime films. He was one, at least depending on who you asked. A fixture of London's criminal underbelly and 1970s cult cinema. Bindon's life played out like a Guy Ritchie script that never got edited for taste. He looked the part perfectly. Thick build, rough voice, 1,000-yard stare that suggested he'd seen things most people only watched in movies. The directors loved it. He brought authenticity that no acting school could teach. Films like Get Carter and Performance cast him as heavies, thugs, and enforcers. And Bindon delivered performances that felt uncomfortably real, because, in many ways, they were. Off-screen, the performance continued. Or perhaps it wasn't a performance at all. Bindon mingled with real gangsters, hung out with the notorious Cray twins, and cultivated a reputation that blurred the line between actor and actual criminal. He'd tell stories in pubs about his underworld connections, and no one could quite tell how much was true and how much was the persona he'd built. That ambiguity was part of his appeal. He also had rumored connections to Princess Margaret, which only added to his mystique, a working-class tough guy who somehow moved between criminal circles and royal parties. It was the kind of story the tabloids loved. But Bindon wasn't just a caricature. In 1978, he was tried for ending the existence of gangster John Dark in what was described as a violent altercation gone wrong. The case made headlines across the country. The details were brutal. A confrontation at a nightclub in Fulham, a fight that escalated, a man who would not survive his wounds. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Some said Dark attacked first. Others said Bindon was the aggressor. Bindon was at the center of it, and the prosecution painted a picture of a man who was too comfortable with violence, too close to danger for it to be mere coincidence. They presented evidence of his connections to organized crime, his history of bar fights, and his reputation for intimidation. The argument was clear. This wasn't self-defense. This was who Bindon was. Bindon claimed self-defense. The trial became a public spectacle, with journalists and the public alike fascinated by the question of whether this screen tough guy was really the dangerous criminal the prosecution claimed. The courtroom was packed daily. People wanted to see if the real Bindon matched the characters he played. His defense attorney argued that Bindon had been attacked, that he'd fought back to save his own life, that his underworld connections were exaggerated by the media. Character witnesses testified that he was a gentleman when sober, that he'd never started fights, only finished them. In the end, the jury acquitted him. 12 ordinary people heard the evidence and decided that the prosecution hadn't proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. By the letter of the law, John Bindon walked away an innocent man. The verdict meant he wouldn't go to prison, but it didn't mean vindication. His reputation collapsed entirely. The directors stopped calling. Insurance companies balked. Studios decided they didn't want the baggage. The same ambiguity that had made him marketable, is he acting or is this real, now made him unemployable. No one wanted to take the risk anymore. The question had been answered, and the answer was too real, too dangerous, too much liability. His connections to the criminal world, which had once seemed like colorful backstory, now seemed like proof of something darker. The Princess Margaret rumors stopped being charming gossip and started looking like evidence of poor judgment across the entire British establishment. How did this man have access to royalty? Bindon retreated from the spotlight, living out his final years in relative obscurity before his passing in 1993 from cancer. He was 50. By then, he'd been forgotten by the industry that had once found him fascinating. His obituaries were brief and focused more on the trial than on his film work. At number 4, Bindon shows us someone who didn't just play evil, he lived it. He existed in that shadowy space where criminality and celebrity intersect. But as violent as his world was, the cases ahead involved far more vulnerable victims, far more calculated predation, far more systematic exploitation of power and trust. We're only at number 4, and already the revelations are disturbing. But the top 3 cases are even worse. We're halfway through this countdown, and a pattern is emerging. Grantham served time, then the BBC hired him anyway. Langham was convicted and tried to return. Nesbitt was fined and kept working. Sellers, Reed, Bindon, all protected by the same machine that values talent over accountability. But the top 3 cases reveal something worse. Sometimes the crime isn't hidden at all. Sometimes we all just choose not to see it. If you want to understand how deep this pattern of institutional protection runs and how far the entertainment industry will go to shield its own, you need to hear what's coming next. Subscribe now so you don't miss the shocking conclusion, because number 1 will leave you speechless. Bindon operated in the criminal underworld, but the next name operated in Australian family rooms, where children and parents trusted him completely, where his face represented safety and warmth and paternal protection. And he used every bit of that trust to commit crimes that would shock the nation. The sitcom dad hiding in plain sight. Before his name made headlines for all the wrong reasons, Robert Hughes was Australia's sitcom sweetheart, a father figure in every suburban lounge room. He made his fame in Hey Dad, a family-friendly juggernaut of late 1980s Australian television. Hughes played the lovable, slightly bumbling dad with a big spirit, the kind of man you'd trust with your kids, and many did. That was the tragedy. The show ran for years, becoming part of the fabric of Australian family entertainment. Parents watched it with their children, finding comfort in its gentle humor and wholesome values. Hughes became synonymous with paternal warmth. The show was so successful it ran for 10 years, spanning 287 episodes. Hughes wasn't just an actor. He was a cultural touchstone, a symbol of the safe, loving father every child deserved. Schools invited him to speak about family values. Parenting magazines interviewed him for advice. He appeared at charity events for children's hospitals, signing autographs and posing for photos with families who adored him. But behind the scenes, he was hiding. Years later, in the early 2010, the facade cracked and broke wide open. Allegations surfaced. First one, then more, then a flood that couldn't be ignored. The courts got involved, and what emerged was a pattern so systematic and deliberate that it shattered everything audiences had believed. In 2014, Hughes was convicted in Australia of multiple charges involving the exploitation and harm of minors. The court found that the offenses were not isolated incidents. It was a pattern, a hidden architecture behind the sitcom set spanning years and victims. The man who had played a protective father had used his position, his fame, and the trust audiences placed in him to prey on the vulnerable. The evidence presented at trial painted a picture of calculated predation. Hughes had systematically used his access and the power dynamics of a television production to create opportunities for harm. Young people involved in the show, aspiring performers, people whose careers depended on staying in his good graces, they became his targets. The prosecution presented evidence of a pattern stretching back years, involving multiple victims who'd stayed silent out of fear that no one would believe them over a beloved television star. Unlike someone who would evade justice through their passing, Hughes faced trial while alive. The proceedings were public, painful, and long overdue. Victims testified with remarkable courage. In the courtroom, victims who had stayed silent for years finally spoke. One described how she'd watched reruns of Hey Dad as an adult and felt physically ill seeing his face. She'd changed the channel instantly, but the damage was done. The sight of him brought everything back. The nightmares, the shame, the years of therapy trying to process what had happened. Another said she'd thrown away every family photo that showed the TV on in the background, terrified she might glimpse him in the corner of the frame. A third victim described how the show's theme song, once cheerful and innocent, now triggered panic attacks. These weren't just crimes. They were psychological time bombs that kept detonating years later. He was sentenced to over a decade in prison with a significant non-parole period. At sentencing, the judge's words were clear and devastating. Hughes hadn't just harmed individuals. He'd weaponized childhood itself. He'd taken the trust that children naturally place in father figures and twisted it into something monstrous. The judge noted that Hughes had shown no remorse, no recognition of the damage he'd caused, no acknowledgement that what he'd done was wrong. The verdict wasn't just against Hughes the man, it was against Hughes the icon. His show was pulled from syndication immediately. His image, once so ubiquitous, was erased from Australian television history. The production company destroyed master tapes. Streaming services removed every episode. DVD box sets were pulled from shelves. It was as if the show had never existed, except in the memories of those who'd watched it, and in the trauma of those who'd been harmed making it. The show's other cast members found themselves in an impossible position. They'd worked on what they thought was innocent family entertainment, and now it was tainted beyond repair. The public reaction was sharp, but not entirely surprising. Former cast members had spoken out, some long before the court case gained traction. Whispers had existed for years, but as with many public figures, whispers often die in the roar of applause. One former cast member revealed that they'd tried to report concerns to production staff and been told they were imagining things, that Hughes was a professional, that they shouldn't spread rumors. The mechanisms meant to protect children had failed at every level. That's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Hughes' story, not just what he did, but how long he got away with it. The mechanisms that should have protected children failed. Warning signs were missed or deliberately overlooked. Hughes' conviction brought a measure of justice, but it couldn't undo the damage. The victims who came forward displayed remarkable courage. Their testimony ensured that at least this time, the predator faced consequences. At number 3, Hughes represents the ultimate betrayal. Using family entertainment as a hunting ground, using paternal imagery as camouflage. The role of protective father was the perfect disguise for predatory behavior. But as systematic as Hughes was, the top 2 cases reveal evil on an even more disturbing scale. One involves a philosophy of violence broadcast to millions and never recanted. The other involves institutional failure, so complete, so systemic, that it changed how an entire nation views fame, power, and protection. Hughes used television fame to access victims. But what happens when someone uses not just fame, but documented philosophy to normalize violence against half the population? When an icon defended violence against women, Sean Connery didn't just play James Bond. He was James Bond, at least in the cultural imagination. For decades after he stopped playing the role, he remained the definitive version. He had the accent, the swagger, the eyebrow arch that could knock over a dictator. He was British masculinity's final form. When people thought of Bond, they thought of Connery. Even after 6 other actors played the role, Connery remained the standard against which all others were measured. Icons occupy a strange space in our culture. We accept them as they are, assume their rightness simply because they've achieved a level of fame that feels permanent. And so when icons speak, there's a tendency to rationalize, to excuse. But Connery talked, and what he said wasn't ambiguous. It was clear, repeated, and defended across decades. In a 1965 Playboy interview, Connery offered up his view on striking women, not in a fictional sense, but as Sean Connery, the man. An open-handed strike is justified, he said, when a woman is being hysterical. He delivered this opinion calmly, matter-of-factly. He wasn't angry or defensive. He stated it as if it were obvious, as if everyone knew this, but no one said it out loud. The interviewer pushed back, suggesting that there was never justification for such behavior. Connery disagreed. He elaborated on scenarios where he believed it was appropriate, speaking with the confidence of someone who'd thought this through and saw no problem with his position. The interviewer, somewhat taken aback, pressed him on it. Connery didn't backtrack. He elaborated, explained his reasoning, defended the position. The interview was published. People read it. Some were uncomfortable. Most moved on. 22 years later, in a 1987 interview with Barbara Walters, the subject came up again. Surely he would take the opportunity to clarify, to walk it back. By then, social attitudes had shifted. The conversation about violence against women had progressed. Shelters had opened. Laws had changed. Public service announcements declared that violence was never acceptable. Surely Connery, now in his 50s, would acknowledge the change. He didn't. He doubled down. When Walters asked him directly about the Playboy interview, Connery confirmed that he hadn't changed his mind. Sometimes, he insisted, it was deserved. He said this on camera, broadcast to millions, with the same calm delivery. Walters looked stunned. She tried again, giving him another opportunity to soften the statement, to add nuance, to acknowledge that maybe he'd been wrong. He didn't take it. These weren't flippant, off-the-cuff remarks. They were delivered in the same tone he used for cocktail orders, like they were facts. Connery spoke about striking women the way he might discuss the weather, casually and without shame. And the reaction? Tepid. A few raised eyebrows, some mild criticism, but mostly silence, mostly acceptance, mostly a collective shrug. Because Connery was still Bond, still a hero, still inconveniently charming. The entertainment industry continued casting him. Major directors continued working with him. Audiences continued celebrating him. The quotes became footnotes, uncomfortable asterisks in an otherwise celebrated career. Steven Spielberg cast him in Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade just 2 years after the Walters interview. The film made nearly $500 million worldwide. The message was clear. What Connery said didn't matter enough to affect what Connery could do. He won an Academy Award. He received Lifetime Achievement honors. He was knighted, all while those quotes remained in the public record, easily accessible to anyone who cared to look. He never apologized, never clarified, never expressed even the slightest doubt about what he'd said. In later interviews, when occasionally pressed on the topic, he would deflect or change the subject, but he never took it back. The silence was its own kind of confirmation. When Connery's life ended in 2020, obituaries had to decide, legacy or honesty. Many tried for both. But the quote resurfaced, in headlines, in think pieces, in furious social media threads. A new generation, discovering the interviews for the first time, was appalled. How was this acceptable? How had he continued working? How had he been celebrated as a hero? There was no criminal charge, no trial, no conviction, no legal consequences of any kind. Just a documented philosophy aired repeatedly, unashamedly, and never retracted. It wasn't hidden, it was broadcast. It was, when a legend says something poisonous and the world nods along, it reveals what we're willing to tolerate, what we're willing to overlook, what we're willing to rationalize away when someone is famous enough, talented enough, charming enough. At number 2, Connery represents a different kind of evil than what we've seen so far. Not secret crimes or hidden predation, but open philosophy, publicly stated beliefs that normalized violence and were met with applause, or at worst, mild disapproval. Some on this list fell for crimes committed in secret, others for cruelty hidden behind closed doors. But Connery, he never fell at all. He lived beloved, his life ended honored, and left behind a question we still haven't answered. How many times does an icon have to tell us who he is before we believe him? Which revelation has disturbed you most so far? And what patterns do you see in how these cases unfolded? Share your thoughts in the comments below and brace yourself, because what's coming next is almost unbelievable. But as disturbing as that cultural complicity is, the final case on this list involves something that goes beyond individual evil into systemic failure. It involves not just one perpetrator, but an entire apparatus of institutions that enabled, protected, and ultimately celebrated someone who was committing crimes on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. We're down to the final case, the one that shocked Britain to its core and changed how we view fame, power, and institutional protection forever. If you're watching this countdown wondering what could possibly be worse than everything we've covered so far, here's your answer. The monster Britain knighted number 1 is Jimmy Savile. Over 450 victims, decades of systematic predation, and an entire nation's institutions that chose to look away. He was the man with the keys to every door. Hospitals, prisons, palaces, children's wards, royal galas. Jimmy Savile wasn't just on television. He was embedded in the architecture of British culture itself. The platinum hair, the gold chains, the cigar always smoldering like some cartoon devil's accessory. He was eccentric to the point of absurdity, beloved to the point of veneration, untouchable in a way that only comes from years of carefully cultivated public image combined with genuine institutional power. And he knew it. For decades, Savile built a reputation as the nation's most generous oddball. He was a charity marathoner, running endless miles to raise money for hospitals and children's causes. He personally raised an estimated £40 million for charity over his lifetime, an astronomical sum that gave him leverage everywhere he went. Hospitals named wings after him. His charity work was so extensive, so public, so seemingly selfless that questioning his motives felt almost sacrilegious. Who would doubt a man who'd given so much? He was a hospital patron, volunteering his time and celebrity. He was a DJ with a gold-plated spirit, they said, someone who used his fame for good. He hosted Jim'll Fix It, a show that became a British institution. Children from across the country wrote in their dreams to meet their favorite footballer, to conduct an orchestra, to fly in a helicopter. And Savile, with that same frozen grin, made them come true. The show ran for 19 years. Thousands of children appeared on it. Millions more watched, dreaming that someday they might get their chance to have their wish granted by the eccentric man with the cigar and the tracksuit. He had connections that would make most celebrities jealous and should have made everyone suspicious. He had tea with Margaret Thatcher at 10 Downing Street. He spent holidays at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence. He reportedly had access to the royal family, spending time at their private estates. And most disturbingly, he had keys, literal physical keys, to Broadmoor Hospital, one of Britain's highest security psychiatric facilities. He had his own room there, decorated to his specifications. Staff were instructed to accommodate him at any hour. He could come and go as he pleased, with access to vulnerable patients that should never have been granted to anyone, let alone a television celebrity. The access he had was extraordinary and should have been terrifying. Hospitals welcomed him with open arms. Prisons gave him tours. Children's wards let him wander freely, often alone with young patients. He moved through institutions that housed the most vulnerable people in society with complete freedom. He had more institutional access than many staff members. Security guards waved him through. Nurses didn't question his presence. Administrators assumed he'd been cleared by someone else. To question Savile was to question an institution. To restrict him was to seem ungrateful for his charity work, to appear suspicious of someone who'd done so much good. And so the questions that should have been asked weren't. The restrictions that should have been imposed weren't. It wasn't until after his passing in 2011 that the lock turned the other way. The allegations didn't trickle in. They poured, then swelled into a flood that became a tsunami. Multiple formal investigations were launched. Operation U-Tree by the police, inquiries by the BBC, investigations by the National Health Service. Each investigation uncovered more victims, more institutions that had failed, more warning signs that had been ignored. Savile had systematically exploited his access and fame for decades to harm the vulnerable. Children, patients, those unable to protect themselves, often in the very institutions that had invited him in. The exploitation wasn't opportunistic. It was systematic, calculated, enabled by the very systems meant to protect people. The scale was staggering. Over 450 victims were eventually identified through official investigations, and that's only counting the ones who came forward, the ones who were still alive, the ones who were willing to relive their trauma in official statements. The true number may never be known. The victims ranged from age 5 to 75. Some were patients in hospitals, incapacitated and unable to defend themselves. Some were children on his shows, starstruck and trusting. Some were people who'd written to him for help through his charity work. Some were staff members at the institutions where he volunteered. The breadth of his predation was as shocking as the scale. The pattern of harm spanned decades, from the 1960s through the 2000s, an almost unimaginable length of time. Throughout all of it, Savile continued to receive honors. He was knighted in 1990 by Queen Elizabeth herself. The OBE came in 1971. Papal knighthood in 1990. Honorary doctorates from universities. Freedom of cities. Plaques, statues, commemorative wings in hospitals bearing his name. The honors accumulated as the victims did, each award giving him more credibility, more access, more protection. But no court case ever happened. He left this world as a free man, buried with honors. His funeral was attended by dignitaries. His gold coffin was displayed at a hotel for public viewing. Thousands came to pay their respects. For a brief moment after his passing, before the truth emerged fully, he was mourned as a national treasure lost. The BBC aired tributes. Newspapers ran glowing obituaries. He died a hero. Only afterward did the full reckoning begin. The BBC issued apologies that felt hollow, given the scope of what was revealed about how much they'd known or should have known. Tributes were retracted. Statues were torn down in the middle of the night. Commemorative plaques were removed and destroyed. His knighthood was posthumously annulled. The headstone on his grave was removed and destroyed. Every trace of his honors was systematically erased. Internal inquiries were launched that read like horror novels in spreadsheet form. documenting decades of failure with bureaucratic precision. The reports documented red flags that were either misfiled, ignored, or never written down at all. Complaints that were dismissed as the ramblings of troubled patients or attention-seeking children. Concerns that were rationalized away because surely someone who did so much charity work couldn't be capable of such evil. Victims who tried to speak up and were silenced or not believed or told they were mistaken. One internal memo from 1973 expressed concerns about Savile's behavior around young people. It was filed and forgotten. The person who wrote it assumed someone else would follow up. No one did. The organizational failures were as damning as Savile's crimes. How does someone harm hundreds of people over decades while working for one of the world's most prominent media organizations? How does he gain access to hospitals and prisons and children's wards while committing these acts? How does he receive multiple knighthoods while active victims should have brought him to justice? The answers are uncomfortable. He got away with it because he was useful. His charity work raised millions of pounds that hospitals desperately needed. His television shows were immensely popular, generating revenue and ratings. His eccentric personality made for compelling television and positive publicity. He was friends with prime ministers and princes, and in the calculus of institutional priorities, all of that outweighed the uncomfortable questions people tried to raise. It was easier to ignore the whispers than to investigate them and risk losing the money, the fame, the connections. Savile himself seemed to understand exactly what he was doing. In retrospect, his public persona looks less like genuine eccentricity and more like calculated camouflage. The outrageous appearance, the platinum blonde hair dyed until he was in his 80s, the gaudy tracksuits, the massive jewelry. All of it created a kind of protective absurdity. He was so strange, so over the top, so ridiculous that serious allegations seemed incongruous. How could this clownish figure be a monster? Surely that was too dark, too implausible. He made jokes about his behavior in interviews that should have alarmed anyone listening carefully. He talked about having a bedroom at psychiatric hospitals. He made comments about young girls that were passed off as his odd sense of humor. He displayed conduct around children and young people that should have triggered immediate intervention. The warning signs were there, broadcast to millions, but dressed up in such bizarre packaging that people laughed them off. Those who did raise concerns were told they were reading too much into it, that it was just Jimmy being Jimmy. Today, Savile's face is more likely to appear in a documentary about institutional failure than on the cover of a television guide. His name has become synonymous not just with individual evil, but with systemic cowardice. When people talk about powerful predators being protected by institutions, they reference Savile. He's become the benchmark for how badly systems can fail. The British entertainment industry changed after Savile. Safeguarding procedures were overhauled. Background checks became mandatory for anyone working with children or vulnerable adults. Reporting mechanisms were improved. Training programs were implemented. The entire apparatus was meant to ensure that nothing like this could ever happen again. The phrase, "never again," appeared in every policy document. In 2024, a major BBC investigation revealed that some of those safeguarding procedures had been quietly relaxed. The reasons given: budget constraints and the need to maintain access for celebrity talent. Staff shortages meant background checks were taking longer, so some were being fast-tracked. Training programs had been cut from annual to every 3 years. The patterns Savile exploited? They're being rebuilt. Different faces, same system. The institutional memory had faded. New administrators didn't understand why the procedures existed. They saw them as bureaucratic obstacles rather than essential protections. Whether those changes were sufficient, whether they came too late, whether similar patterns could emerge again, these questions remain disturbingly open. The question that lingers: if the system didn't catch him, if he operated openly for 50 years with hundreds of victims and left this world before facing any consequences, then who else slid by in the smoke? How many others understood that celebrity, charity work, and calculated eccentricity could provide cover for the unthinkable? How many are operating right now, using the same playbook? That's why Savile is number one, not just because of what he did, though the scale and duration are staggering, but because of what it revealed about all of us. About what we're willing to ignore when someone is famous enough, charitable enough, entertaining enough, useful enough. About how institutions protect their own reputations before they protect the vulnerable. About how silence becomes complicity, and complicity becomes participation, and participation becomes the system itself. Savile's legacy is a warning. Not just about individual evil, which exists and always will, but about collective failure. About what happens when institutions value their reputations more than the safety of those they're meant to protect. About the danger of celebrating people without scrutinizing them. Of granting access without accountability. Of of confusing fame with virtue and charity with character. The man who made dreams come true for children on television was, in reality, creating nightmares that would last lifetimes. And he did it while the entire country watched, applauded, and honored him with some of its highest distinctions. That's not just his failure. It's ours. If these revelations have moved you, please share this video with someone who needs to understand these truths. These stories need to be remembered, not buried. 9 names. 9 stories that span from ending a life to systematic predation, from psychological cruelty to cultural complicity. Some faced justice. Others left this world honored, but they all share something essential. They operated in a system that valued image over integrity, profit over protection, fame over truth. The BBC gave Savile keys to children's wards while ignoring complaints. Studios kept casting violent men because settlements were cheaper than losing star power. The press turned acts of violence against partners into footnotes while building legends around destructive behavior. Audiences laughed at Reed's bar fights, applauded Connery's charm, and welcomed Hughes into their homes, never questioning what happened when cameras stopped rolling. This wasn't just their failure. It was ours. We choose what we're willing to see. We choose when to believe victims and when to protect legacies. We choose whether charm and talent excuse cruelty and crime. And for decades, collectively, we chose wrong. These stories aren't just history. They're warnings about how easily institutions protect power, how readily audiences forgive charm, and how long truth takes to surface when everyone benefits from keeping it buried. They're warnings about what happens when we value entertainment over ethics, when we prize charisma over character, when we let fame become a shield instead of a responsibility. The real question isn't how they got away with it for so long. The real question is, how many are still getting away with it now? How many current celebrities, how many current systems, how many current institutions are protecting their own while victims wait for someone, anyone, to listen and believe and act? How many people are watching this right now and thinking of someone they know, someone they work with, someone whose behavior makes them uncomfortable but who seems too important to question? Thank you for staying with us through these difficult truths. Subscribe to this channel if you want more honest examinations of entertainment history, because the only way we prevent these patterns from repeating is by refusing to forget, refusing to excuse, and refusing to let charm and fame excuse behavior that would destroy ordinary people's lives. The only way forward is accountability. The only way forward is believing victims. The only way forward is demanding better from the systems that are supposed to protect us. Until next time, this is the Golden Age Files. Remember, icons are human. Fame isn't virtue. And the most important question we can ask about anyone, no matter how beloved, is not how talented they are, but how they treat people when no one's watching, when there are no cameras, when there's no audience to perform for. That's where the character reveals itself. That's where the truth lives. And that's what we should celebrate. Not the performance, but the person behind it.